Welcome back. We are going to move into the endocrine system. This is an incredibly important system because endocrine dysfunction underlies so much of our human diseases. So as you get into pathophysiology, things like that, you're going to see that hormone imbalances or oversecretion, undersecretion, they are at the heart of many diseases because hormones are generally trying to maintain some type of homeostasis, and lack of homeostasis is where disease starts. So this will be a clinically important chapter for you to come back to later on in your studies. Certainly we will see this in 252 over and over and over again. Isn't Pituitary cute? He's so cute. Okay, so when cells want to communicate with each other, they've got a few options. Gap junctions are a direct cell-to-cell communication. Neurotransmitters we release from a nervous cell onto some other type of effector cell. A paracrine is a hormone-like chemical that is going to be released from a cell, but instead of going into the blood, it's going to go into the extracellular fluid, and it's going to affect just the neighboring cells. And then we have hormones, the basis of the endocrine system. These are chemicals that are released into the blood, and so they're going to be able to have target cells anywhere in the body. So it doesn't matter where the gland is, the hormone will be able to get to its target cell because it's utilizing the blood. So here are some of the endocrine organs. So some of them we have seen before, something like the pineal gland, the hypothalamus. So these were parts of the brain that we studied. The pituitary is something that we're going to be getting into very shortly here. Thyroid, parathyroid, thymus. We've got the pancreas and adrenal glands in the abdominal cavity, the gonads down in the pelvic cavity. This is not an exhaustive list, though. We're going to find out that there are certainly other things that can act as an endocrine organ. So your stomach, your intestines, your heart, your kidneys, these all release hormones under the right circumstances. So this is just the sort of more classical presentation of the endocrine system. So let's compare the endocrine and nervous system, since they are both basically sort of in the job of coordination and integration and making sure that everything maintains homeostasis. These used to be classified as a single system. We had what was called the neuroendocrine system. That's how closely related we believed that they were. Once we began to tease out the differences, we separated them out. So if we kind of look at this, we can see that a neuron has a direct relationship with the target cells. So whether it's a gland or skeletal muscle, it doesn't matter. The neuron directly interacts with it via the synapse. In the endocrine system, we are going to release hormones into the blood, and they're going to go through the blood and they're going to activate any cell that has a receptor for the hormone. So you could have target cells really far away. You could have target cells spread throughout the body. All it takes is a receptor. So here we can kind of compare a couple of these. So we've got neurotransmitters versus hormones, synapses versus release into the blood. Nervous is very local, so these neurotransmitters are going to activate really only the target cells that are right there, whereas the endocrine system can have a much more widespread effect if you've got target cells throughout the body. Nervous system is very, very fast. Endocrine is maybe a little bit slower, but it can also be very slow. We could be talking about days for the reaction. The stop is very similar. So in the nervous system, it stops very quickly. You take away the neurotransmitter, boom, you're done. Endocrine can continue responding well after the stimulus is gone. And then when we look at how quickly they adapt, so the nervous system adapts very quickly, whereas the endocrine system is very, very slow. Okay, so we're going to start with kind of the bosses of the endocrine system, the ones that sort of run the show here, which are going to be the pituitary gland and then the hypothalamus. So we've talked about the hypothalamus. We know that it is part of the diencephalon and that it is a collection of multiple different nuclei where we have cell bodies of neurons. So the hypothalamus is going to direct the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland is going to direct everybody else. So you're kind of looking at something like, president and vice president, or, some type of hierarchy of control there. So let's talk about the pituitary gland since we've already looked at the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is also called your hypophysis, and there are two lobes to it. The posterior lobe is known as the neurohypophysis because it is actual neural tissue. It is part of your brain. The anterior is called the adenohypophysis because it is glandular tissue. If we look at the embryonic development, we can kind of see how these two very, very different tissues end up sharing a space. So here is your neural tube that's developing, okay? And this is your kind of area of your, eventually what will be the hypothalamus, and you get this downgrowth, okay? This is the neurohypophyseal bud. While at the same time, in the mouth, you're going to form this little pouch that is called the hypophyseal pouch, or what's known as Rathke's pouch. So this is oral epithelium, and we know that glandular tissue is epithelial. We studied that in tissues. So this is part of the lining, basically, of your mouth that is going to pinch off and is going to migrate up at the same time that the neurohypophyseal bud is migrating down. Now, where we are right now is in the sphenoid bone. So this is your sphenoid bone. This is the sella turcica right here. And this is the hypophyseal fossa down here. So this is where we are. So this is all happening very early on, and we get an upgrowth of the oral epithelium and a downgrowth of the brain that's going to give us this pituitary gland that has an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. So the posterior is going to be a true portion of your brain. There is a neural connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, and it consists of axons. So this is just a continuation of neural tissue. Now, there are two nuclei in the hypothalamus that are going to contain cell bodies that synthesize what are called the neurohormones, oxytocin and ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. These neurohormones are produced up in the hypothalamus, and they travel down the axons into the posterior pituitary where they are stored and then released as needed. The posterior pituitary is not a true gland because it does not synthesize its own hormones. The hormones are synthesized in the hypothalamus. They are simply stored and released from the posterior pituitary. The anterior lobe is that true glandular epithelium. The connection to the hypothalamus here is going to be via a really teeny tiny little blood supply called the hypophyseal portal system. The hypothalamus is going to release what are called releasing and inhibiting hormones into that little blood supply. It's going to travel to the anterior pituitary, and is going to regulate what the anterior pituitary does in terms of its hormone secretion. So here, let's take a closer look at this idea of the connections. The posterior pituitary is connected via axons. It is simply a downgrowth of the brain. So here you have two different nuclei in the hypothalamus, so the paraventricular and the supraoptic. And here you can see there's the cell bodies of the neurons. This is where ADH and oxytocin are made. They travel down the axons through what's called the stalk, okay, or what also known as the infundibulum. And they are going to be basically stored in the posterior pituitary and released as needed in response to what are called neuroendocrine reflexes. We'll talk about. Now, the anterior pituitary doesn't have a direct connection because it's not part of your brain. It's not nervous tissue. So we've got, again, neurons up in the hypothalamus in one of our nuclei that are going to make and secrete their own hormones into this hypophyseal portal system. So these hormones that are released by these guys are going to travel down these veins, portal venules here, into the anterior pituitary, where they will then have some reaction. They will force the anterior pituitary cells to do something. So the hypothalamic hormones are going to be things like gonadotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone. Okay, so all of those are going to travel down here, and they're going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone, to release thyroid stimulating hormone, to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay. We also have some inhibitors. So we have a prolactin inhibiting hormone. So when that travels down, it will inhibit the anterior pituitary from secreting prolactin. Okay. Somatostatin is also going to be an inhibitor. So basically, the hypothalamus, in terms of its relationship with the anterior pituitary, is going to release a set of hormones that is going to tell the anterior pituitary to either release hormones or don't release hormones. It's going to stimulate it or it's going to inhibit it. So posterior, the hormones are made up in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, released in response to a reflex. The anterior pituitary actually makes its own hormones, and they will be released in response to releasing hormones from the hypothalamus that arrive via blood. Let's talk about this concept of controlling the release here. The posterior pituitary is going to use what are called neuroendocrine reflexes. The release of ADH and oxytocin is not going to rely on a releasing hormone. They're going to be released when there is a change in the physiological state of the body. And we'll talk about those specific physiological states in a moment. But as soon as something changes physiologically, these will release. The anterior pituitary is going to use releasing and inhibiting hormones that come from the hypothalamus. So let's just kind of take a look at an example of kind of how some of this would work. So we've got our releasing hormones from the hypothalamus that target the anterior pituitary, which then is going to cause the release of hormones that would target the peripheral endocrine structures. So let's talk about thyroid. That's an easy one. Thyroid hormone is metabolic, and we should always have circulating thyroid hormone in our blood. So the trigger to start this cascade is going to be low levels of thyroid hormone. That's going to cause the hypothalamus to release a thyrotropin releasing hormone that targets the anterior pituitary. That's going to cause it to release thyroid stimulating hormone that targets the thyroid. That is then going to pump out thyroid hormone. Now, the thyroid hormone will go to all of our target organs, which is basically every cell in your body. So this is a very widespread effect for a hormone. But will also, the high levels in your blood will come back and using negative feedback will shut down this process because too much thyroid hormone is no better than not enough. So we use negative feedback here. The posterior pituitary ADH will use a negative feedback. Oxytocin tends to function on more of a positive feedback, and we'll kind of talk about that in a second. Okay, we're going to start with the two posterior pituitary hormones. I pulled these tables from a different book because I like them. So oxytocin, this is going to be stimulated by pressing on the cervix and uterine stretching during the labor process. And then also suckling of the breast tissue. So the oxytocin basically plays a role in birth and breastfeeding. So the uterine stretching, the cervical and uterine stretching is going to function on a positive feedback. The more the baby's head pushes down on the cervix as it gets really going with birth, then that's going to trigger a neuroendocrine reflex. So it's going to activate neurons that are going to travel up through the hypothalamus, and it's going to trigger the release of oxytocin, which is going to travel via the blood to the uterus, and it's going to trigger uterine contractions, which is going to further push the baby's head down on the cervix, which you're going to get more oxytocin, more contractions, more pushing, and eventually this will result in birth, and that's when it will shut off, when there's no more pushing on the cervix. The same concept works with the suckling of the breast for breastfeeding. As the suckling begins, then it's going to target the breast tissue and it's going to cause what's called the letdown reflex. So oxytocin causes the mammary glands to be squeezed so that the breast milk can be ejected. As soon as the suckling stops, the oxytocin stops and the ejection will stop. So those are your neuroendocrine reflexes involved with oxytocin. ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, is going to be mainly activated when you either have a decrease in blood volume or an increase in the osmolarity of your blood. In other words, you're getting too salty because you're lacking water. So this will then travel to the kidneys and it will cause the kidneys to reabsorb water, which will fix either one of them. If your volume is low, water will help. If you're too salty, water will dilute you. So those are neuroendocrine reflexes. So there's no releasing hormone. If you push on the cervix, oxytocin is going to be released. Okay, there's no middleman there. These are direct reflexes that occur in response to these set triggers. Now, our anterior pituitary hormones we know are going to be a little different. So we're going to go through those. We've got growth hormone. So stimulation is growth hormone releasing hormone. Targets are liver, muscle, bone, cartilage. This is what makes you grow, okay? So your bones grow in response to growth hormone. Your muscles grow. This has targets, receptors on all of these tissues that undergo significant amounts of growth. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to be stimulated by thyrotropin releasing hormone. The target of TSH is going to be the thyroid hormone, causing it to release thyroid hormone. ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, is going to be stimulated by corticotropin releasing hormone, targets the adrenal cortex, and causes the release of glucocorticoids like cortisol. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to be stimulated by gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's going to target the ovaries and the testes. So in the ovaries, it's going to stimulate follicle growth and estrogen production. And in the testes, it's going to stimulate sperm production. Luteinizing hormone is also stimulated by gonadotropin releasing hormone and also targets the ovaries and the testes. So in the ovaries, luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate ovulation, also increase the productions of estrogen and progesterone, and in males, it's going to cause the production of testosterone. Prolactin is the only one that doesn't really have a true releasing factor, but it has an inhibiting factor. And so most of the time, prolactin is being inhibited. And then when you have the hormones of pregnancy and birth, late pregnancy and birth, then you begin to decrease the inhibition that allows all of this to get going. So prolactin targets the mammary glands and causes the synthesis of breast milk. So it's going to cause what's called lactation to occur. Prolactin causes milk to be made. Oxytocin causes milk to be released. So there's two different hormones that are involved in breastfeeding. We'll get more sort of into that concept when we talk about that in the reproductive system.